Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and this video is going to be on the recap of the 2022 season. We're going to be looking at the kickers. This introduction portion will be in both videos, so if you've already seen this and you know what I have to say in the introduction, skip on forward. But if you haven't seen it yet, then stick around for a little bit, because I'll be going over the entirety of the position quickly with some information that won't be in the rest of the portions of either of these videos. Also, a quick note, if you are looking at this screen in front of you and you are confused and maybe you want to know more about my equalized value EV system, then please check out a video which I'll put a little card at the top right hand portion of the screen for you to that video. That should be, I believe, the overvalued wide receivers video, the first video of this series, which has a lengthy explanation, which is why I'm not going to go into the explanation in each of these videos. Now, I am having some sound issues. I've torn down all of my sound, and we'll see if this video ends up making it up onto the internet or not, depending on how the sound turns out. This is kind of my test video for that. With that said, let's get moving on with the position. First of all, right off the bat here, I'm sorry about this color choice. Could have been more diverse in the colors. Don't know why I ended up going with this scheme and not getting some of the reds down at the bottom. Whatever. I think for the most part you can tell the differences in here, but could have done better there. My bad. Now let's just look at the position as a whole in the 2022 season. Based on my EV scale, who was the best? Who was the worst tight end? Kicker. And I looked at the top 24 kickers based on both the top 24 overall points in the 2022 season and the top 24 based on fantasy points per week, with of course a minimum amount of weeks that they need to play in order to qualify. We'll go through this in tiers. If you're familiar with my EV system, that should help. But here is the color scale, and here is the kicker 1, kicker 6, kicker 12, 18. Those are the colors that represent how they scored, but here's the overall performance. So the kicker 12s was the best average kicker that we had via the EV, and that's going to be Daniel Carlson, Justin Tucker, and Brett Maher as the top 3 kickers of the 2022 season. Then in the next 12 guys who averaged as a kicker 15-ish, roughly, would be Jason Myers, Michael Badgley, Tyler Bass, Graham Gano, Cameron Dicker, Eddie Pinheiro, Robbie Gould, to wrap that up. So my top 10 kickers there. Just a huge pile of guys in this next tier. So really the position is run out after 10 guys, I would say, that are really going to be able to give you some sort of difference on the season scale. The kicker 18s on average per week are going to be Evan McPherson, Young-Ho Koo, Nick Folk, Matt Prater, Chris Boswell, Riley Patterson, Chase McLaughlin, Harrison Bucker, Kaimi Fairborn, Matt Gay, Brandon McManus, Greg Zerloin, Cade York, Ryan Suckup, Jason Sanders, Greg Joseph, and Will Lutz. Over on the far right-hand side, you can see these are the average fantasy points per week. This is based on the first 17 weeks of the season, not week 18. Most fantasy playoffs don't go to week 18. A lot of teams do some funky things on week 18 with players not playing and whatnot. So I just think that first 17 weeks is better, more accurate to look at. And over to the right of that is the average, how well they did based on the average ranking. So you can kind of see some of the big differences here if you look at those numbers and what differences they have compared to how they're actually ordered right now. One other thing I do want to quick point out, just so you have some sort of reference here, is that the number 1 kicker on average per week scored 17 fantasy points, plus or minus 2 points. That's how they would have gotten this purple here. Once again, you can see more on that on the wide receiver video. The number 6 kicker on average per week would have scored you 11 fantasy points in 2022 and 2021. This is 2 years of data now. And for the number 12 kicker, 9 points, 18, 6 points, 24, 4 points, 30, 2 points. So as you can see, once you get into roughly kicker 12, we're already at a point where you're just holding up the position, not really, even kicker 6, not a whole lot better. Not really helping the overall team to win or lose games most weeks. Of course, they can be the difference maker. That's just how the position works, already dying out by the top 6 time kicker on average. For the number 3 overvalued kicker with an equalized value of number 22, however, in average fantasy points per week, ranked number 14th player, we have Greg Zerloin. Just a quick heads up for this position, I will be considering all ties to be more of a negative for the overvalued kickers, as they are supposed to be better than the competition that I am comparing them to, not equal to them. When we look at Greg Zuerlein, who I have highlighted down here, versus the rest of the guys who, as you can see over on the right, via the average fantasy points per week, are supposed to be worse than Greg Zuerlein. However, based on the EV ranking, are actually better or provided more value across the season. That's the theory here. Those are going to be all of these guys that are above him on the EV ranking list. And when looking at Greg Zuerlein's profile here for the 2022 season, in over a third of his games, Greg finished as a kicker 21 or worse. But he did have a couple of solid kicker 1 performances, as you can see there in week 3 and in week 13, which really helped to boost his weekly average quite dramatically. But never getting above 10 fantasy points outside of those 2 performances really hurt his equalized value. And so when comparing him versus Evan McPherson, Matt Prater, Chris Boswell, Riley Patterson, Harrison Bucker, Kaimi Fairborn, Matt Gay, and Brandon McManus, he has a head-to-head record of 53, 50, and 6. So a couple more victories there than losses, but the 6 ties kind of pushes it over the edge, as I was getting at, with the considering the ties to be kind of a negative factor in the instance of overvalued kickers. At number 2 for the overvalued kickers, we have the EV ranked number 17th player, fantasy points per week ranked number 11th player, and that is Chase McLaughlin. Just like last time, I have Chase highlighted there so you can see him compared to the likes of Cameron Dicker, Robbie Gould, Evan McPherson, Matt Prater, Chris Boswell, and Riley Patterson, who he will be going head-to-head up against in this matchup. Much like Greg, Chase had 2 great kicker 1 performances, and he also had a top 6 performance. However, he finished as a kicker 18 or worse in over 50% of his games, one of those being a 0-point performance, which is quite rare for kickers. As you can see, it looks like his first week back. Let me know if he actually didn't play this game, but he was just active or something. Then when looking forward to next year, I could always correct that. But just as far as I know, looking at last year, his head-to-head record against these guys who are supposed to be worse than him was 32, 33, and 4. Not too great. Now, before we move on to the next kicker, a quick couple of honorable mentions here. First, we have Brett Maher, who was the average ranked 1st player across the entirety of the season. However, the EV would put him back at 3, just a little bit further back. And for Young-Ho Koo, he was the average ranked 9th player, the EV ranked 12th player. And now for the number 1 ranked most overvalued kicker from the 2022 season, we have a player who finished as the 13th ranked player on the EV scale. However, the fantasy points per week had him all the way up at number 7. And that player is Nick Folk. Did my best announcer voice there. With 2 kicker number 1 performances and 3 top 6 kicker performances, Nick Folk definitely provided some of the same boom that he did in the 2021 season, but those performances should not be overvalued. They very much could have helped push fantasy squads over the edge for 2 or 3 victories across the entirety of the season. However, his 0 point, 1 point, 2 point, 2 4-point and 5-point performances may have equalized those victories out, with a few losses potentially even being more detrimental due to the 3 horrible games versus the 2 great games that he had. And his head-to-head record definitely suggests that that could be the case very easily if you were to have rode Nick Folk all season long. And so versus Graham Gano, Cameron Dicker, Eddie Pinheiro, Robbie Gould, Evan McPherson, and Young-Ho Koo, how did he do head-to-head? Well, not so great. He went 36, 30, and 39, and he also had 9 ties. So 36 wins, 39 losses, and 9 ties, which once again are not looking good on the record for guys who are supposed to be beating these guys up. I mean, you look at the difference here, ranked 19th there for Evan McPherson in fantasy points per week. Should have a winning record, right? Well, equal value system comes through and it shows us, hey, don't overrate the big games, because he did have some type games. And so that is it for the overvalued kickers.